So today we're going to start talking about the causes of the Cold War leading up to really a long span of time where there was a lot of anxiety and tension as to would this turn into a full-fledged war or even in another world war. And so as we look at this, what is a Cold War? Well, during the 1900s, countries around the world, they are fighting this unusual war. It was called the Cold War. It lasted for more than 40 years. And it's called cold because it was fought more with words and threats. There were not actual weapons firing. If you think of hot, like explosions and fighting and shooting, like that kind of war, luckily it never turned into that. But we were on the brink of war within maybe hours, several times, or just one word spoken as to all right, it's time for an attack. And both sides of this war, it could have easily happened. And so really reviewing where we're at, let's pick up where we left off. In 1945, at the very end of World War II, President Roosevelt, FDR, dies, unfortunately. President Truman steps in. This is April 2nd. And very soon after, May 8th, is when Germany surrenders. So that's victory in Europe. Okay. And then just a few months later, eventually to end the war, President Truman drops bombs on Japan, August 6th and August 8th, Nagasaki and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so September 2nd is the day that Japan finally completely surrenders. That's victory in Japan, VJ Day. World War II is over. So that's really where we left off. And so now, September 2nd, 1945, World War II is over. Where do we go from here? At the end of World War II, the Allied armies, they freed all the nations in Western Europe. Okay? Everything that had been taken from Germany and conquered, those countries were made free. They agreed to help the countries. They wanted to help them recover, even though Germany and Japan was responsible for the damage and destruction within many of those countries. The United States wanted to help them recover. It benefited them in many ways to see Europe built up again, and they wanted to help the people there. And so the Allies helped them form new governments, gave them money, rebuilt their cities, and then the Allies left Europe. Okay, so the United States made sure that these European countries were moving in the right direction, started to help rebuild, and then they left. Unfortunately, that did not happen on the eastern side of Europe. Okay, very different. The Soviet troops, they moved into Eastern Europe, headed toward Germany. Remember, they were on our side, and as they were able to get hold of Germany and the war ended, they had passed through all of these eastern countries, and so Russia then stayed in these countries after the war. They didn't, try to help rebuild and build up and leave, but they stayed in these countries, Poland, Romania, this eastern half of Europe here is called the Eastern Bloc. And so eastern part of Germany they also kept, and they set up their system of politics, their political system of communism. And so they wanted to make sure that all of these European countries aligned with what they were doing with communism. Okay? And even though the Soviet Union and the United States, they had been allies and friends and working together during World War II, they did not have much in common. They were superpowers, but the United States had a democratic government, a democracy, and then the Soviet Union was communist. Okay, they controlled their citizens in different ways. It was not the same thing, a democracy and communism, and so they did not see eye to eye in a lot of ways. And so what happened is they began to really distrust each other. America and the Soviet Union ended up being so different, their beliefs and their political systems, that this tension started to build up. And at any given moment, war could have happened. And this was called the Cold War. It was a war of words and threats and building up of weapons that luckily never got to the point where they were fired at each other, but that's what the Cold War is. And so as we look at this, when we talk about the Cold War here, focusing on communism, really the idea of communism to many people sounds good on paper, in theory, okay? Because it promises equality for everybody. The government controls everything, but they are say that they are going to distribute the wealth equally to people so that, the poor people are not left um, with problems while the rich thrive and have all the power and money. And so it's based on this equality where everybody gets the same amount. Okay. What happens though is if everybody's equally rewarded the same, then people don't have an incentive to work hard and create their own business and do their best and move forward, really. And so does not work very well as a system, and the economics behind it turn into huge problems. And so if we take a look here, a communist government, they own all the business, all the land, they have the ownership, where democracy, like in the United States, it's owned by the people, not the government. It's owned by the people, and they own businesses, they can start a business, they own their land, and so it is the freedom to choose what to do with that. And some businesses work out, some don't, but that is the risk as an entrepreneur that you can take in a democracy. Whereas the communist country doesn't allow that because the government controls everything, once again, so that they can hand out the wealth equally. So individuals do not have much freedom. They don't get to make many choices in the communist government as citizens. Whereas in the United States, democracy promotes personal freedom, free enterprise. Remember, people can start their own business. They can be an entrepreneur and try to take risks to make more money and thrive. In the Soviet Union and communist countries, citizens did not have freedom or rights. They could not speak up. In fact, just like we've talked about with lots of dictators, communist dictators do not allow people to speak out against their government. And so just like, this continued in the Soviet Union, where you could not speak out against your government, against your leaders, you'd be thrown in jail. And in fact, over the course of his reign, Joseph Stalin actually killed more people, like 20 million people, which is more than what had happened during the time of the Holocaust in Germany. So this was not a man that treated his citizens well. In the United States, they value human rights. Citizens have freedoms and rights based on the Constitution. So you could see there are huge differences. And you could see why Soviet Union would want to keep as many European countries as communist so that they could support what they're doing and get their people to accept it and just say, this is the way it is. This is how a lot of people have it. And really, they did not want them exposed to the other Western, quote unquote, countries that had a lot more freedom. They didn't want them to know what they're missing. And so the Soviet Union has all this territory, this red. Joseph Stalin made sure that these red countries were established as communist countries. Okay, so you had the red, the Soviet Eastern Bloc. These countries in red were no longer free to make their own laws. They couldn't make their own governments and leaders. Most of the citizens who lived in these countries could not leave. They could not travel beyond their own borders or communicate with anybody else who lived on the outside, mainly because, once again, the government did not want people to see what freedoms other countries had. In fact, they went a long way with the news and radio to prevent people understanding what it was like in other countries around the world that had a democracy and had a freedom. And they spread lies so that they could maintain and keep control of their country. Whereas you could see a good chunk of Western Europe still is democracy or freedom or some form of that where they elect their leaders. So you can see there's a big division here. And so that's where it became clear, this division. Joseph Stalin's actions alarmed a lot of countries, specifically Great Britain and United States, who were strong allies. And so Winston Churchill came out with his famous speech. He said, "An iron curtain has fallen across Europe." Okay? This was used by Winston Churchill. He was the leader of Great Britain, and after World War II, he's just describing how Europe had split in half, with the Eastern Europe becoming communist and the countries of Western Europe being more capitalist and having choices and free market. And really, in the end, remember, this happened because of the way that Europe was divided after the war. They had been defeated in World War II by Great Britain and the United States. They invaded from the West, where Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union was invading from the East. So after the war, the Soviet Union stayed in these countries, kept control of them, and Winston Churchill and President Harry Truman were scared that these countries would be ruled by strong government dictators. They felt like that these dictators would be similar to Hitler in Germany, and so they feared Joseph Stalin, and that's where there became a problem. And so this Iron Curtain, it was more figurative. It was not actually a literal iron curtain. And people confuse this with the Berlin Wall that we're going to be talking about soon in future lessons, where there was actually a wall built, a physical wall in Germany, in Berlin, which we'll talk about. But the Iron Curtain is figurative. It's just that division between the East and the West. Okay, and it was as if this curtain, this iron curtain or wall, shut out the West from the East in this division. And so you can see on the map here, once again, that strong, bold line there is considered what the Iron Curtain is. There wasn't always necessarily dividers or divisions, but in what they believe and how their governments controlled their economy and their leaders and how they set things up, that was this imaginary curtain or wall. And so we're going to be studying more and more just about how this division caused more and more problems with the United States and Russia and the Soviet Union moving forward. Have a great day.